Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of our new podcast series on the future of higher education, this time focused specifically on the future of publication. With me today, it's my great pleasure to say, is Sacha Vignieri, the deputy editor of Science magazine. Sacha is formerly also a postdoc both at Harvard and UC San Diego, and prior to that got her PhD in zoology from the University of Washington. It's a great pleasure to have you today with us, Sacha.
Thanks so much, Oliver. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, so Sacha, today we're really going to be talking quite broadly about scientific publication in academia, as well as, in particular, we're going to focus primarily on a basic question that a lot of sort of early career academics and young scholars in the sciences will wonder, which is, or maybe dream, which is how do I get my publications into Science magazines?
Yeah.
So before we dive straight into that, I want to talk first give you a chance to briefly introduce yourself. So Sacha, as I mentioned, you're the deputy editor of Science magazine, but tell me a little bit about what it is that you do, what kinds of fields that you cover.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Oliver. Yeah. Thanks for that nice introduction. And so I cover organismal biology kind of very broadly. And what that means functionally is that I handle papers on animals that are not being used as model systems. So everything from ecology and evolution and conservation biology to things like fisheries and biomechanics and vertebrate paleontology, so dinosaurs and things like that. So it's a pretty broad field, or set of fields, I should say. And so I handle papers in those fields. I also, as deputy editor, am involved in things like strategy and management of the journal more broadly. And so that's how I fill my days.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And so as an editor, you are probably arguably one of the best people actually to be talking about this question of sort of from the early career academic perspective, from the young scholar perspective. Publishing is something that is often quite daunting for younger scholars, quite mysterious even. So the goal here today is really just to talk a little bit about how the publication process works, to gain a few insights and tips maybe from you in terms of how we might begin even sort of thinking about what to work on as we sort of enter into the sort of hope for publishing, and sort of go from there, from sort of this brainstorming stage all the way to the actual writing tips and sort of what happens all the way after that. So maybe we can begin at the very beginning then, in just thinking about how do we begin thinking about what kinds of areas we want to be working in and thinking about as we approach publication?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because I think a lot of people, most scientists want to get a paper in Science. It's one of these things that, not necessarily the best situation, but is the situation where it can actually change your career. So most junior scientists really want a Science paper. And of course, only about 5% of all papers that are submitted to Science get accepted at Science. So it's a big hurdle to jump. And I think a lot of students or postdocs or young researchers think that you can only get a paper in Science sort of if you have kind of luck, right? There's sort of this serendipity, you happen to come across a big finding and you just get lucky. And that does happen, obviously, but you really can kind of think about ways to prepare yourself or prepare your research for the kind of work that might fit in a journal like Science. And so what you want to think about is the fact that Science is a general science journal. So we really want work that is kind of broadly interesting across fields. And we also want work that's a conceptual advance. So when you're trying to think about the kinds of questions that you might ask to sort of fit those categories, you can really kind of come up with a plan that can put your research in a place where some of it might be published in a place like Science. And so the best way to do that really is to figure out where your work sits within the broader field. So let's say you think about your field, what kinds of questions is your work answering that the field really needs to be answered? And that is a challenging thing to figure out, but the way to do it, and researchers always hate hearing this, but the way to do it is to spend a lot of time reading, because when you read what's going on in your field now and what went on in your field in the past, you can really figure out like what questions are essential that have not yet been answered, and really sort of start to think about those questions. And then the other thing to think about as you're kind of thinking within this broader context is the fact that science is always moving. And so if you're trying to target, let's say, a question for what's happening right now in science, both with a small s and a big S, you kind of might miss the boat. And so I like to think of it as like a soccer or football analogy, right? So in soccer or football, you lead the pass, right? So you're running along, you have the ball, you pass to your teammate, and you don't want to pass where they were a minute ago. You want to pass to the future. And so that's the same kind of thing when you're thinking about work that might be right for science in the future. And the other thing to keep in mind is that all research is valuable. And so everything that you do is worth doing, and it might fit in one journal or another. And then every now and then you might come up with this really special thing that should go to science, but it's all valuable no matter where it ends up.
So tell me a little bit about, so you mentioned this word earlier, conceptual advance. So this is sort of a little bit of a highfalutin philosophical question almost, but what counts as a conceptual advance?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it could be a lot of different things, but the idea is that it's something that either really moves a field forward or changes how we think about a field. It might be something that's answering an age-old question that hasn't been answered yet. So it's these kinds of questions or findings where there's just a real sort of step change in what we know. And everybody thinks about sort of the paradigm shift, and those are incredibly rare, right? It's almost never that somebody finds something that completely upends what we know. But it's not that rare to have a finding that really shifts our knowledge forward in a major way, or really helps us understand something that hasn't been understood yet, but we really need to understand. So it's those kinds of questions or findings that we sort of think of as being a conceptual advance.
And there's another point I want to also quickly circle back to, is that earlier you mentioned this idea of a fit between the work that you're doing and the kind of publication that you're trying to aim for. So I want to expand a little bit upon this point, because I do think it's an extremely valuable point for especially early career academics to think about, is that the most prestigious journals and the most prestigious venues aren't necessarily going to be the best ones. So maybe if you can expand on this point about fit a little bit, sort of how do we think about what makes the most sense, both in terms of where our publications would have the highest chance of getting published, but also what makes the most sense in terms of our careers and sort of our work in and of itself.
Yeah. So another sort of great thing to be thinking about, and I think the way to think about it is that we all have kind of different pieces of our research as we're going along, and some of it is just going to really expand our knowledge, or some of it's going to be quite detailed, some of it's going to be very specialized, meaning that it's really most important to the people that are working in that field. It could be a change in method, or some big sort of shift in thinking that really just applies to kind of minute details of a system. Those are the kinds of things that you'd want to publish in a specialized journal. And those things, while people sometimes say, well, why not publish them in somewhere like Science? There's more to that in a second. But first of all, when you publish something that's quite specialized like that, the target audience, you really want to be the people directly in your field. You want those to be the people who are getting that table of contents, are making sure that they're checking that journal regularly because it's their own special journal. And that's where you want to put the stuff that really speaks to your field and the specifics of your field. When you're targeting a place like Science or Nature or PNAS or Cell, these kinds of journals that are more general, they have higher impact factors, but their audience is also much broader. And the editors of those journals also want your work to be broader. So you want to target those kinds of journals when you're thinking about something that not only is a conceptual advance in your field, but also might be understandable by someone in a different field, not necessarily, the guy walking down the street, but another scientist. So if I'm an ecologist and I'm writing a paper and it's an ecology paper, I want sort of the chemist to be able to sort of see, oh, okay, I can kind of get, based on how that paper's written, why this is a big advance in this field. And similarly for the chemist and the ecologist. Now, we don't always get that right. And sometimes you'll see a quite specialized paper appear in Science, but that's kind of the goal. And so as you're thinking about your career and where you want to publish and how you want to kind of develop a CV full of publications, what you really want is to kind of have a mix of both if you can. So of course, everybody wants to get the Science or Nature paper. With only 5%, you might get one of those in your career, and that'd be great. And even if you don't, that's okay too. And if you do, you also want to make sure that you have other really solid specialized work in other journals, because that shows that you're not just kind of shooting for this one type, that you're really solidly based in your field and your work.
And I do want to have you expand a little bit on this, of sort of the distinctive sort of publication that Science and Nature are, where the impact factor is higher. It's more, it truly is a publication for science, not for cell biology and the latest developments and so on and so forth.
Right.
And so one thing I want to ask you a little bit, want to learn a little bit more about is sort of what is the mission, let's say, or the philosophy of this distinctive kind of publication? Sort of how does it fit in with your understanding of scientific practice more generally? Why do we have and why do we need these kinds of publications?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. I'd say there's kind of two reasons. So one reason is sort of what the AAAS, which is the nonprofit American Association for the Advancement of Science, what their goal is for a journal like Science is to help sort of create a place for the scientific enterprise, but to have that place be something that helps society, so that really translates for society. So yes, the guy walking down the street might not pick up an issue of science and be able to understand it, but the science journalist down the road might be able to. And so they can help translate. And so I think on the one hand, those kind of journals are really about providing kind of high profile places for science that has the potential to have the most impact on the world in a place where it can be noticed and easily accessible and translated for the general public. So that's one part of, I think, the remit of the journals. The other part is more for the scientific society. And so in that case, I'd say these journals kind of see themselves as a little bit of a shortcut in some ways. And that's how they're often used by tenure committees and hiring committees, and right or wrong, and sometimes it's not always great, but that's often a way that they're used in order to provide a place where you have a bunch of professional editors who do this all the time and who read like 50 papers a week and can really tell when work is really different. And so we can kind of do the work that researchers don't have time to do. And so we can sort of say, okay, look, here's a really big breakthrough that you should know about, and we're going to publish it in our journal. So it's a way for the broader scientific society to have a little bit of a shortcut in finding what's the most exciting in their field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose at the end of the day, that is hopefully more so than the sort of career advancement reason, the reason why everybody wants to get a paper in science. Yeah, and having this sort of, let's say, this hub of the most impactful and most exciting developments in science for the scientific community, and also for the wider community to sort of be able to circle back to and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. So we've talked a little bit about these sort of very big picture questions of how should I conceive of my research, what fits best into science. Perhaps we can sort of now come back a little bit more in detail and talk about something a little bit more, let's say, grounded in terms of like how we should actually be approaching writing these papers, especially for a publication such as Science.
Yeah. So it is different to write a paper for a place like Science, mostly because they're much shorter than they are at other more specialized journals. And then there's also this issue of the fact that you're targeting a more general audience. So you have to walk this line between being somewhat accessible, but also still being grounded enough in your own science that other researchers in your field respect what you're saying. And so it does take some practice, and it does take a little bit of a different way of thinking. And the way that I usually tell people, I mean, there's like a specific, approach that you can use for writing these kinds of journals that literally is like the conclusion. I mean, the introduction should say something in 1 to 3 paragraphs where you put the work in context, you state your question, and you talk about why it's important. In the middle, you have 3 to 6 paragraphs where you report your results, you talk a little bit about your system. And in the conclusion, you have 1 to 2 paragraphs where you interpret your work and discuss its implications. And so that's kind of the very basic way that you literally sort of like the mechanics of writing these kinds of journals, kinds of papers. And then in general, what you want to think about is being very minimal in your words. So we publish papers that are about 3,000 words. And so it's not that many, right? So you want to get rid of extraneous discussions. You want to make sure everything pertains directly to what you're doing. You want to avoid using jargon. You want to try to practice kind of really having like context, results, implications as your way of thinking. So you're not getting kind of lost in what we do in longer papers where we talk a lot about side related discussions or potential future work or alternative ways that this could have been done. Those kinds of things are super valuable, but there's not room for them in a science paper. So you're really just focusing in on what you did, what you found, and why it matters.
And this, I suppose, this raises another question, which I think you would be in the best position possible to answer, in fact. And it's that academics are most useful and most used to and most comfortable with publishing in their specialized journals. And I imagine there is going to be some sort of a bit of a translational period almost between sort of getting their work to fit the language of your specialized journal and then getting it to fit the language of somewhere like Science. I suppose one thing I want to ask is how much of the editorial process is also sort of involved in that translational work?
Yeah, I mean, a fair bit. So in an ideal world, we love it when papers come in and they're written perfectly for Science and we have very little to do. But in practice, we end up doing quite a lot of editing of papers. So, they go through the revision and review process, and then kind of at the end, we need to make sure that they're sort of appropriate for Science in terms of format and not too much jargon, and are they being clear? Does it flow well? So there's actually quite a lot of that involved in preparing a paper for Science and probably Nature too, because of this translation you're speaking about, where not everybody's used to writing in that format. And so we want to help people get there.
Yeah, and with that, what are some of the most common gaps that perhaps you see between sort of and these are sort of the papers that are already sort of you're interested in publishing.
Yeah.
The results are great. The breakthroughs are exciting. But what are sort of the final gaps that even in these papers that you often see sort of would be helpfully closed ahead of time?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's a couple that come to mind that I see quite often. One is this, what I was talking about earlier, where you sometimes just have extraneous discussion or words that really are not directly relevant to the work. And so those get cut. And sometimes that's hard for authors. It's a lot easier for an editor to cut up a paper than an author. So we help them out with that. The other one that I feel like we do quite often is to edit out jargon. And a lot of authors these days like to use acronyms for everything. They'll turn recently I saw a paper that turned a single word into an acronym. So, we don't like those. They inhibit comprehension. And so we end up asking authors to change those, or we'll change them. And so I'd say that kind of fine tuning of the language happens quite a bit. We also often help out with figures. So figures are really important. They make a big impact. And so that's another area where we often spend time kind of giving feedback to authors that they wouldn't get in another journal.
Yeah, so that's all been super useful. We've talked a little bit about sort of the actual publication process, how to approach it, and so on. I want to now sort of circle back to some of our earlier discussion about these bigger picture issues of the place of the philosophy, the mission of somewhere like science. And I want to sort of home in on how this mission now fits within broader discussions of a move towards things like open access journals and this this sort of increasingly popular discourse around open access journals and so on and so forth. Sort of how does that fit in with the mission of science and small s and bigger S?
Yeah.
And yeah, so what are some thoughts on these issues?
Yeah, so open access has been, I'd say open access, the emergence of open access has sort of followed my career at Science. When I started, it was just kind of starting to get going, and now it's really almost, kind of taken over the situation. And so the thing about open access is that in theory, it's a great way to make sure that data that the public paid for is available. In practice, however, somebody has to pay for the processes that go into publishing. And even if it's a journal that doesn't have professional editors, there's still a lot that goes into publishing. And so it's been it's consistently been a challenge to try to figure out how to do that. And I'd say now what's happened is that open access has sort of turned into this model where it's author pay. So the authors pay to publish their work in journals. And while there's some things about that are maybe okay, they help to make the papers more open, there's some problems too. So there's kind of inherent conflicts that can come up with somebody paying to publish their own work. It also majorly decreases access of various groups to the scientific enterprise. So if you're at a big university, you have big government grant, it's no big deal to pay our article processing charges, or APCs. But if you're coming from a smaller university or another country, those charges can be completely prohibitive to publishing. And so even though the majority of for-profit publishers are going the author pay model, Science has decided not to. And so what we're doing instead is we are completely compliant with these sort of Plan S guidelines, which require open access papers, because we do allow for the accepted paper to be posted. But we are not charging authors to publish. Instead, we're sticking with our subscription model, which we feel like allows more people more access to publication. And so we're kind of hoping that this model actually picks up some steam, because it's getting so expensive for authors to publish their work that it's really hard for a lot of authors. And so if we can sort of walk this line where authors aren't having to pay, and yet we're able to provide the open papers through other models, that we can kind of have the best of both worlds. And the reason that Science is doing that, I think, is because we're published by AAAS, who has this larger goal of philanthropy, science philanthropy. And so we really care a lot about the access. We do have one author paid journal, Science Advances, we keep the charges quite low. But in general, our model is to do this other approach. And personally, I hope that it's something that catches on, because I have a little bit of fear about just the ever increasing charge to authors and cost for them to publish. And there's predatory journals out there too that are charging people that aren't even, and they're not even really publishing anything. So it's a bit of a dicey landscape right now.
Yeah, and the publishing landscape is it is fraught with all of these sort of issues, from sort of predatory journals up to, and at the same time, one of the interesting things about this particular field and industry and so on, is that it is inherently connected with sort of our knowledge enterprises, science, and so on and so forth. So there's inherent tensions built in, it seems, between what it's trying to do with the fact that doing things costs money and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And one thing that I want to ask, I want to press a little bit more about, is sort of, if you can tell me a little bit more about the advantages of the model that science is trying to push nowadays, especially in light of the rise of author pay journals and so on. Sort of, can you say a little bit more about how this is giving us the best of both worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing I think that is a sort of best of both worlds situation is the fact that we're not charging authors to publish their work. And so basically we're sort of a forum for sort of people that are, no matter where they are in the world or at institutions, no matter who they are, if they have really exciting work, they can publish it in Science, and it's not going to cost them anything. Except right now we do still have small charges for color figures, but we do not have article publication charges. So we're sort of providing this platform for people no matter where they are. And I think that's kind of the most important component, because we want to facilitate access everywhere to everyone who has really strong work. And the way it's the best of kind of both worlds, and not just that world, is that because we're able to provide the accepted paper. So what the accepted paper version is, it's basically the paper that was accepted without all the sort of copy editing and things like that. So that can get posted as soon as it's sort of officially published. Authors can post it on their website. It can be posted in certain repositories like PubMed. So that allows for open access, right? So anybody can come and look at it. And the subscription model is the subscription, not model. I mean, it is the model, but the subscription charge is still there because we still have to pay for the journal production. And we sort of feel like institutions who pay kind of have the funds to continue to pay for the full version that has like the news and the commentary. And so institutions get an enhanced version by paying an institutional charge. The public gets a free version, and the authors get to publish their work without having to pay article processing charges. So we think it kind of satisfies all kinds of things and makes it the best for access for everyone.
Great. That's it, and it does sound now much clearer to me sort of how exactly it is best of both worlds. And I suppose the further question, though, and this might be as we sort of approach the end of this podcast, one of the last questions I want to really hone in on is, what do you think is really preventing the adoption of these sorts of models, more broadly speaking?
You know, I think a lot of it has to do with just generating profit. So this is my personal opinion. So, keep that in mind. But what I've seen evolve through this open access process is that at first it was really pushed by the scientists, and it was pushed in a very ideal sort of way. Like, we want our work to be open access without the conditions of how that happens. And the big publishers resisted it for a long time. And then the wheels started to turn more and there was more momentum. Governments started saying, no, we want open access too. And the big publishers kind of came up with a way that they could do it and make a lot of profit. And so that's where we are now. So the big publishers are making a lot of money off of open access. And they like that. And the authors are getting, and the governments are getting open access, and they like that. And now the authors are sort of the ones suffering, even though they really push this in from a very ideal and pure perspective. And so I think the reason that the AAAS model has not really taken hold yet is because there's now resistance from big publishers who are making a lot of profit off of the current model. And so it'll be interesting to see what goes on in the future, and whether the fact that this model that we're using is really much more open for everybody and provides better access across the board, if that will actually encourage a shift from the for-profit publishers.
Mm-hmm. And I guess and this is, again, very speculative, very big picture. But would you say that these sorts of, that kind of shift would, at the end of the day, likely have to involve things like policy shifts and so on, sort of larger scale shifts, rather than, a willing abandonment of the profit motive?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the pessimist in me says yes, but I'm not sure what the policy shift would be, because it'd have to be something that pushes those publishers that are making a lot of profit, pushes them into the different, this other model. And how you would do that through policy, I'm not sure, but that doesn't mean somebody else isn't. Somebody else might know. But it is true that usually, big companies don't forego large profits for the sake of the greater good. So, maybe they will, we can hope, but I imagine it would have to be either a very big kind of uprising from communities or some sort of policy shift.
Yeah, and I imagine part of this would also just involve people talking more about it and understanding that different models are available, and that leading publications such as Science offer counter models to what we find elsewhere as well.
Yeah.
Which seems like a fitting place to conclude today's episode. So we've talked, so just as a quick roundup, we did talk a little bit in the beginning today about some more, let's say, day-to-day sort of roundup. How do we get published? What is the mission and philosophy of Science? How do I think of my work as with respect to the kind of publication that Science is and the kind of mission that it holds? Beyond this, though, we've really sort of shifted to some big picture talk discussions about the mission of Science with a capital S as well as a small s, and how it fits within sort of the broader publication landscape, and some of the potential ways in which this mission might be increasingly important given the shifts in the landscape that we see today. So with that, Sacha, I just want to say thank you so much again for joining me on this episode. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and I've learned so much. And yes, thank you once again for your time.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Oliver. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed it.